In the late 15th century, the Iberian Peninsula was a land forged in conflict, a crucible of faiths where centuries of war had finally drawn to a close. The Reconquista was over. Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, had fallen to the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. But victory did not bring unity, it brought suspicion. Within their new kingdom lived thousands of conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, and Moriscos, their Muslim counterparts. Whispers of heresy, of secret rituals practiced behind closed doors, poisoned the air. Ferdinand and Isabella, obsessed with forging a single, purely Catholic Spain, saw a threat that needed to be purged with fire. They petitioned the Pope, seeking an instrument not of conversion, but of control, an institution to hunt down and eradicate dissent in its most private forms. In the year 1478, Pope Sixtus IV granted their wish, unleashing a monster that would feed on fear for over 300 years, the tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was not born of grassroots fanaticism. It was a state-sponsored machine of terror, meticulously designed and centrally controlled. Its power was absolute, its authority derived directly from the crown and the church, a terrifying fusion that placed it above all other laws. To question the Inquisition was to question both your king and your God, a crime for which there was no defense and no mercy. At the head of this beast was a man whose name would become synonymous with religious cruelty, Tomás de Torquemada. As the first Grand Inquisitor, he was the architect of its procedures, the author of its pain. He was a man of supposed piety and asceticism, yet he possessed an unyielding, cold-blooded conviction that any measure, no matter how brutal, was justified to purify the faith. His reign would set the standard for the centuries of horror that followed. The Inquisition's first order of business was to establish its presence, to make its power known and feared in every city. They would arrive in a town and issue an edict of grace, a chillingly deceptive proclamation. It offered a window, typically 30 to 40 days, for heretics to come forward, confess their sins, and receive a lighter penance. It was a poison-laced piece of bread, a promise of mercy that was, in reality, a tool for gathering information. The true purpose of the Edict of Grace was to turn citizen against citizen. While the self-confessed might receive a manageable punishment, they were forced to denounce everyone else they knew to be a heretic. Friend was compelled to betray friend, a child to inform on their parents, a spouse to condemn their partner. A web of accusation and paranoia began to spread, ensnaring entire communities in a grip of collective fear. Once the Edict of Grace expired, the Edict of Faith took its place. Now, there was no mercy, only duty. Every citizen was commanded, under penalty of excommunication, to report any heretical behavior they witnessed. Keeping a secret was now a sin as great as heresy itself. The Inquisition had effectively deputized the entire population, turning every neighbor into a potential spy. The grounds for accusation were terrifyingly broad and often absurd. Was a converso seen wearing clean clothes on a Saturday, they must be observing the Jewish Sabbath. Did they refuse to eat pork? A clear sign of Judaism. Did they turn their face away when a crucifix was carried past? Heresy. Even the simple act of washing your hands before a meal could be twisted into a sign of deviance from the one true faith. Once an accusation was made, often anonymously, the machine of the Inquisition whirred into motion. There was no investigation, no presumption of innocence. The accusation itself was proof enough to act. In the dead of night, the familiars of the Holy Office, lay servants of the Inquisition, would arrive at the victim's home. The knock on the door was a death knell. The arrest was a brutal, swift affair designed to maximize terror and confusion. The accused was dragged from their bed, often still in their nightclothes, without explanation or charge. Their family could only watch in horror, their pleas and questions met with stony silence or a sharp blow. The victim would simply vanish into the night, swallowed by the insatiable appetite of the Holy Office. Immediately upon arrest, the Inquisition seized every last possession of the accused. Their home, their money, their land, their tools, everything was confiscated to pay for their own imprisonment and trial. This single act plunged their family into instant destitution, turning them into outcasts. It was a cruel and calculated move, ensuring that even if the accused were somehow acquitted, they would return to a life of complete ruin. The destination for the accused was the Inquisition's secret prison. These were not ordinary jails. They were lightless, airless dungeons, often located in the basements of castles or monasteries. The cells were cramped, filthy, and crawling with vermin. Here, the accused was thrown into absolute isolation, a deliberate tactic to break their spirit before the interrogations even began. Time itself became a weapon in these cells. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, with no contact from the outside world. The prisoner had no knowledge of the charges against them, nor who had accused them. They were left alone with their thoughts, their fear, and the chilling sounds of the prison, the distant clang of a door, the faint, muffled scream, the scuttling of unseen things in the dark. This psychological torment was designed to make them desperate to confess to anything. The food provided was meager and often spoiled, just enough to keep the body alive, but not enough to maintain strength. Water was foul, and sanitation was non-existent. Disease ran rampant in the squalid conditions. For many, the prison itself was a death sentence, a slow, agonizing decay of body and mind long before they ever faced a judge or a torturer. After an indeterminate period of this soul-crushing isolation, the accused would finally be brought before the inquisitors for their first audience. They would enter a stark, imposing chamber, often draped in black. At a long table sat the inquisitors, Dominican friars, their faces impassive and cold, along with a scribe tasked with recording every word, every stammer, every sigh. The atmosphere was one of absolute, terrifying authority. The interrogation would begin with a seemingly gentle invitation to confess. The inquisitors would urge the prisoner to search their soul and unburden themselves of their sins against God. They were never told the specific charges or the identity of their accusers. The prisoner was expected to guess their crime, a cruel psychological game where they might confess to minor sins in the desperate hope of satisfying their captors, only to inadvertently incriminate themselves further. The prisoner was denied any form of legal counsel. The inquisitors acted as prosecutors, judges, and jury. The accused was trapped in a legal nightmare where the rules were unknown and the outcome was preordained. Every denial was interpreted as obstinacy, every hesitation as a sign of guilt. The very act of defending oneself was seen as a challenge to the Holy Office's authority, further damning the soul they claimed to be trying to save. Witnesses for the prosecution were welcomed, their identities always kept secret from the accused. However, witnesses for the defense were almost never allowed. In the rare case they were often viewed with extreme suspicion. To speak in defense of an accused heretic was to risk being accused of heresy yourself. The system was a closed loop, designed not to uncover truth, but to confirm guilt. If the prisoner continued to maintain their innocence after several of these audiences, the inquisitors would issue their first official warning. They would be taken on a tour of the torture chamber. This was a calculated act of psychological warfare. They would be shown the instruments of pain, each one explained in gruesome detail by a hooded torturer. The sight, the smell of blood and fear in the air was often enough to break the will of the strongest person. If the threat of torture was not enough, the actual application would begin. The inquisitors would be present, along with a doctor and a scribe. The doctor was there not out of mercy, but to determine how much pain the victim could endure without dying prematurely. The scribe's job was to record the proceedings, noting every scream, every plea, and most importantly, any words that could be twisted into a confession. One of the most common forms of torture was the strappado, or la garrocha. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, and the rope was looped over a pulley on the ceiling. They were then hoisted into the air, causing excruciating pain as their arms were pulled from their sockets. To increase the agony, they would be suddenly dropped, stopping just before they hit the floor, the violent jerk tearing their muscles and dislocating their shoulders completely. Another favored method was la toca, the water cure, a horrifyingly intimate form of torture. The victim was strapped to a board or a ladder with their head lower than their feet. A cloth was forced into their mouth and down their throat, and water was slowly poured onto it. The cloth would become saturated, swelling to cut off air and inducing the sensation of drowning. The victim would thrash and choke in a desperate, panicked fight for breath. The most infamous instrument of all was el potro, the rack. The victim's wrists and ankles were bound to rollers at opposite ends of a wooden frame. As a torturer turned a handle, the rollers would pull in opposite directions, slowly and inexorably stretching the victim's body. Ligaments would tear, joints would pop, and bones would dislocate with audible cracks. The pain was absolute, a white-hot agony designed to obliterate all thought except the desire for it to stop. The torture was applied in sessions. The inquisitors, following their own twisted rules, would claim that any confession had to be freely given. Therefore, they would halt the torture and demand the victim confess. If they refused, the torture would resume, considered not a new session, but a continuation of the previous one. This legalistic charade allowed them to inflict limitless pain while maintaining a veneer of procedural correctness. Under such unbearable duress, almost everyone confessed. They would admit to being secret Jews, Muslims, or witches. They would implicate their family, their friends, their neighbors, anyone whose name was suggested by the inquisitors. The confession was not a discovery of truth. It was a creation, a script written by the inquisitors and extracted through pain. The words were the victims, but the story belonged to the Inquisition. After the confession was secured, it had to be ratified. The next day, the prisoner, bruised and broken, would be brought before the inquisitors in the audience chamber and asked to confirm their statement. They were warned that any retraction would be seen as a relapse into heresy, and the torture would begin anew, often with greater intensity. Most, terrified of returning to the chamber, would whisper their assent, sealing their own fate. With a ratified confession, the trial was effectively over. The inquisitors would then meet to decide the sentence. These deliberations were secret, the fate of the accused decided behind closed doors. The punishments varied, but they were always designed to be a public spectacle, a powerful warning to all who might consider straying from the path of orthodoxy. For lesser offenses, the punishment might be public humiliation. The convicted would be forced to wear a San Benito, a yellow penitential garment, often painted with flames or demons depending on the crime. They would be paraded through the streets, subjected to the jeers and abuse of the crowd, their shame made a public spectacle for all to see. This mark of infamy would often cling to their family for generations. Other sentences included lengthy prison terms, often for life, in the perpetual prisons of the Inquisition, which were little better than the secret dungeons they had already endured. Flogging was also common, with the condemned being tied to a post in the public square and whipped a proscribed number of times. Others were sentenced to serve as oarsmen on the royal galleys, a brutal fate that was often a slow-motion death sentence. The ultimate expression of the Inquisition's power was the auto da fe, or act of faith. This was a massive public ceremony, a piece of religious theater on a terrifying scale. It was a day-long event, attended by royalty, church officials, and thousands of ordinary citizens. It began with a grand procession, a parade of the damned, where the condemned were marched from the prison to a large public square or cathedral. During the auto da fe, the sentences were read aloud for all to hear. The names, the crimes, and the punishments were announced with great solemnity. For those who had confessed and reconciled with the church, their sentences of imprisonment or flogging were confirmed. But for those deemed unrepentant heretics or those who had relapsed, the sentence was the most dreaded of all. They were to be relaxed to the secular arm. Relaxed to the secular arm was a chilling euphemism. The church, claiming it did not shed blood, would hand the condemned over to the state authorities for the punishment to be carried out. This was a legal fiction that absolved the inquisitors of the final act of killing. The state officials would then lead the condemned to the quemadero, the burning place. At the quemadero, stakes had been erected. The unrepentant were tied high up so the crowd could get a good view. Those who had repented at the last minute were shown a small mercy. They would be garroted, strangled with an iron collar before the flames were lit. For the defiant, however, there would be no such mercy. They were to be burned alive. As the wood at the base of the pyre was lit, the crowd would often fall into a hushed silence or murmur prayers. The fire would catch slowly, the smoke billowing up before the flames. The victims' screams would pierce the air, a sound of unimaginable agony that was the centerpiece of this horrific ritual. The smell of burning flesh would fill the square, a scent intended to be a stark and unforgettable lesson in the price of heresy. The inquisitors and priests would watch, their expressions serene, believing they were performing a righteous act. In their worldview, the fire that consumed the heretic's body on earth was a holy fire, a final act of purification that might save the soul from the eternal fires of hell. To them, the screams were not sounds of torture, but the sounds of a soul being cleansed, a necessary and just conclusion to their holy work. The auto da fe was the ultimate propaganda tool. It demonstrated, in the most visceral way possible, the absolute power of the church and the state. It reinforced social cohesion through shared fear and ritual. For those who watched, it was a terrifying reminder to police their own thoughts, to guard their own words, and to report any deviation they saw in others, lest they end up on the pyre themselves. While the Inquisition's initial focus was on conversos, its insatiable need for enemies and revenue soon led it to expand its targets. The Moriscos, Christians of Muslim descent, became the next major group to suffer. They were accused of secretly practicing Islam, their unique customs, language, and dress used as evidence of their supposed ingrained heresy. The Inquisition sought to erase their cultural identity with the same ruthless efficiency it had applied to the conversos. The rise of the Protestant Reformation in Europe provided the Inquisition with a new, terrifying threat to combat. The fear of Lutheran and Calvinist ideas spreading into Spain led to a brutal crackdown on anyone suspected of harboring heretical books or beliefs. Owning a Bible translated into Spanish, for example, was considered a grave crime, as the Church insisted on controlling the interpretation of Scripture. The Inquisition became a firewall against the intellectual currents sweeping the rest of Europe. The Inquisition also turned its attention to a wide array of other perceived sins. Blasphemy, bigamy, and sodomy all fell under its jurisdiction. Superstition and what was deemed witchcraft were also prosecuted, though the Spanish Inquisition was notably more skeptical of witchcraft claims than its counterparts in other parts of Europe. Nevertheless, for the accused, the process of arrest, interrogation, and punishment was just as terrifying. The long arm of the Inquisition even reached into the Spanish colonies in the Americas. Tribunals were established in Mexico, Peru, and Colombia to ensure the religious purity of the new settlements. They prosecuted not only Spanish colonists for heresy, but also sought to stamp out any surviving indigenous religious practices among the native population, viewing them as a form of idolatry and devil worship. The power of the Inquisition was not merely religious, it was a potent political tool. Kings could use it to eliminate powerful rivals or nobles who challenged their authority. A simple, anonymous accusation of heresy was enough to neutralize a political enemy, stripping them of their titles, wealth, and life. The fear of the Inquisition kept the powerful in line and reinforced the absolute authority of the crown. The economic impact of the Inquisition was devastating. Since all property of the accused was confiscated, a cottage industry of informants and accusers flourished. Personal grudges and business rivalries could be settled with a quick, anonymous denunciation. This constant threat stifled commerce and innovation, as acquiring wealth made one a more tempting target for the resource-hungry Inquisition. For centuries, the Inquisition cast a long, dark shadow over Spanish society. It fostered an atmosphere of deep-seated paranoia and anti-intellectualism. Science, philosophy, and art were all viewed with suspicion, and a rigid, unthinking orthodoxy was enforced through terror. Spain, which had once been a beacon of learning and tolerance, was slowly isolated from the rest of Europe, its cultural and intellectual life choked by fear. The decline of the Inquisition was a slow, gradual process. By the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment had begun to challenge the foundations of absolute monarchy and religious fanaticism. New ideas about reason, human rights, and tolerance began to seep into Spain, and the Inquisition started to look like a barbaric relic of a bygone era. Its power waned, its executions became less frequent, and its authority was increasingly challenged. The institution was first abolished during Napoleon's occupation of Spain in the early 19th century. When the Spanish monarchy was restored, so too was the Inquisition, a desperate attempt to cling to the old ways. However, its revival was short-lived. The forces of liberalism and modernity were too strong to resist, and the Spanish people themselves were no longer willing to tolerate its tyranny. Finally, on July 15, 1834, the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition was officially and permanently dissolved. After more than 3.5 centuries of existence, the reign of terror was over. The doors of its prisons were thrown open, and its dark archives, filled with the records of countless shattered lives, were unsealed, revealing the true scale of its methodical cruelty to a horrified world. The legacy of the Spanish Inquisition is a chilling testament to the dangers of unchecked power and religious intolerance. It demonstrates how faith, when fused with state authority, can be twisted into an instrument of oppression, control, and unimaginable cruelty. It was a system that perfected the art of psychological warfare, turning society against itself and using the fear of eternal damnation to justify temporal atrocities. The exact number of victims will never be known. The Inquisition's meticulous records speak of tens of thousands executed and hundreds of thousands more whose lives were destroyed through imprisonment, confiscation of property, and public humiliation. But behind each number is a human story of terror, of a family torn apart, of a life extinguished in the name of a rigid and unforgiving God. The screams from the torture chambers have long since fallen silent, and the ashes from the quemaderos have long since been scattered by the winds of time. But the story of the Inquisition remains. It serves as a dark and vital warning from history that the path to hell can be paved with righteous intentions, and that the most monstrous acts are often committed by those who believe they are doing the work of heaven.